Honourable Speaker, the motion before us today is this House regrets government action to combat climate change. Now, before I get into more of our contentions and how we're going to model and frame this debate, I do have a couple of pieces and a quote from our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Recently, Trudeau stated that no country would find 300 million barrels of oil in the ground and just leave it there. This was a quote by our Prime Minister. This quote emphasizes and explains the false dichotomy that governments create, which allows for there to be this differentiation where you can either have economic development or environmental protection. We don't necessarily think this false dichotomy is beneficial to our society today. And additionally, it makes it seem like we are actually doing a lot, but realistically what we aren't. And our government has continued to hide behind this false dichotomy and has continued to actually push forward and actually contribute to a lot of the climate change that is occurring within our society today. So before I get into more of my contentions, I'd like to model and frame this debate so that we can clarify everything for the round coming before us. So this House we define as Canada. We recognize as well that this will include both federal and provincial governments, as provincial governments do have jurisdiction over their natural resources. In terms of regrets, we think this is a key term that we need to define within this debate. So regrets, we regret past projects, including the Kyoto Protocol, carbon taxes that have been made, and the Paris Climate Agreement, which we are still currently a part of. We think these are just examples of past projects that have been taken on by governments. And we also regret the future trajectory that our government is taking as of right now. We think that the trajectory they are taking, and currently, at the present moment, we don't actually see there being any sign of moving towards a more productive economy and actually contributing to better climate protection programs. We think that this looks like the federal government taking a wishy-washy stand, a very soft line on climate change, where they tell the public that they support environmental regulations, but then they also support things like pipelines and allow for the destruction of the climate at the same time. As well, there is no unified stance within the government as of right now, so we think that this essentially embodies what we want to include. We think that an alternative to this moving forward would potentially be taking more specific and targeted actions. So we think banning single-use plastics was a great initiative that was started, but we don't think that we can just change one aspect of our lives, which is what the government has focused on. We think there needs to be plenty more action and needs to change our entire lifestyle, and we think that's how we need to move forward and legislate and regulate more. But Honourable Speaker, I'll take my first POI.
Mr. Speaker, would you not agree it's almost against the meaning of regret to regret the future? How can you regret an action that hasn't already been taken? Is that not against the spirit of the word regret?
Honourable Speaker, recognize that it's not necessarily saying, we're not saying that future action will all be terrible or won't necessarily help the climate movement, but what we think right now, in the present, what we see happening is that we're just taking stances that have already been taken in the past. We see stances that are quite wishy-washy that the government has taken that aren't actually necessarily going to promote better climate activism and better climate change and climate actions to combat this sort of mechanism. So now that I've sort of clarified the model and how we will be defining the terms of this motion, I'll just be going into what I'll be talking about and then what my partners will be discussing later on. So I will be predominantly focusing on this false dichotomy that I mentioned earlier, and more so on Indigenous groups and minority groups and how they have been the most affected by this climate change action. My partners will go into more of the economic harms that we see coming forward and what we've already seen in the past. And finally, we will be going into more of how this is bumper sticker activism and doesn't actually necessarily promote better climate change activism, not at this time. So now going into the false dichotomy that I mentioned near the beginning of my speech. Recognize that yes, what our government has done has always insinuated this narrative of where it's the economy versus the environment. But recognize that these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. I give you the example of Denmark. While Denmark is still a smaller country, we do see that they've prioritized both things. They have really strong economic policies and they have really strong environmental policies. They are one of the most green countries within the world, and they have the most investment in green tech as well. We think that that's a standard that we should be striving towards, where governments recognize that it isn't necessarily a toss-up between the two. You can have both of these. We think that as well, what happens when the government promotes this false dichotomy, it encourages a lot of complacency. So individuals don't necessarily feel like they have to take a super strong stance on the environment because they don't see that coming from their government. They see their government saying that it has to be one or the other, and then individuals within the country replicate those types of views and believe that they can only do one or the other. But Honourable Speaker, I'll take my second and final POI.
Okay, so do you regret government action to combat climate change? Would you rather have there be very minimal action?
Honorable Speaker, we actually advocate for more climate action. Like I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, we regret the past actions that the government has taken and potentially the future trajectory because we don't think it is enough. We think it is a soft stance that the government has taken, and we think it could be done a lot better, and we've presented to you a couple of examples of ways that we think we should improve this. So we don't think that climate action should stop by any means. We think climate change is really escalating and it needs to be addressed immediately, but it shouldn't be done in the way, and we regret the way it has been done in the past. Okay, so now that I've told you a little bit about the false dichotomy, we'll go into more detail and specific examples a little bit later on in our speeches. But I'd now like to draw you to Indigenous groups and minority groups. So what we think happens under this model, where the Canadian government has not meaningfully engaged in climate change action, hasn't taken a strong enough stance, they also haven't meaningfully engaged with Indigenous groups and minority groups. We tell you that these groups are the most disproportionately affected by climate change. So whether that be them living on reserve, not necessarily having great access to land or water, it also occurs in rural communities where they are losing a lot of their wildlife, where they're losing a lot of farmland. We think that this is essentially what happens when the government doesn't take a strong enough stance on the environment, is that everybody hurts within our society. It also means that people become complacent and don't feel like they have to do more because they think that the government is already doing enough. So why should smaller advocacy groups, why should other individuals or the general Canadian public take on more when they don't see their government taking on that same type of action? We think that government policies lead to their citizens believing in a certain way, and this certain way is inherently detrimental to not only Indigenous people and minority groups, but to the environment as a whole. So, as much as Canada advocates itself as being a climate leader, the climate changes actions that we have taken have been minimal. So the Kyoto Protocol and Paris are not binding accords. They are simply a voluntary agreement, and the Canadian government has not done enough to address these. So along the theme of well-intended but poorly executed, we think that there needs to be more climate change action, and we regret the past actions that have been taken. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, when a government acts, its people listen. This is the nature of government policy. This is the nature of government implementation. It's to encourage behavior. It's to nudge people in the right direction. And it's to show people what the government values. Side government would have you believe that if the government does nothing, people will suddenly understand that climate change is right now really important and take the stance on their own. We think that we failed to see that in the past. You're going to see that right away from our constructive argument, talking about the role of the government to step in when we see this failure to act. And we think that their side automatically falls based on that assumption. I'll be getting into that very soon. But first, let's talk about the resolution at hand. The idea that this House forgets government action to combat climate change. Right off the bat, we just want to say that we don't think that they necessarily interpreted this correctly. We come up here today, we read the resolution, it says government action to combat climate change. It does not say specific government action. It does not say this government action. So they cannot then come up and tell you that we regret government action towards climate change, but we're actually encouraging more government action towards climate change. We find that contradictory in and of itself. We don't understand what approach they were taking with this. We're going to carry on, just something to point out. Now, the case line and the burden that we think that they have to prove to us today, which we failed to see from their first speech, we hope to see it come up in the next, is that they have to prove to us why government action specifically, government action, is regrettable when it has proven positive impacts, which you're going to see from us, when it was justifiable at the time, and when it's given us knowledge that we would not have otherwise had we not taken that action in the past. Those are the three prongs that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to prove each one to you, each in our separate speeches. How are we going to do that? I'll start by talking to you about the role of the government, which is essentially to step in when we see a market failure, when we see that something is important but people are failing to act, when we see it's time to set a precedent to nudge behavior. Second, we're going to talk about the idea of the impacts of government action. So just because something doesn't necessarily achieve the desired goal, right? Like they tell you some of the harms of climate change in the past, just because it didn't achieve the exact desired goal doesn't mean it didn't have a positive impact in other ways. We're going to talk about the repercussions of that. Finally, the idea that hindsight is 20/20. So this is all about the value of learning from the past, learning from our mistakes, especially when decisions that were made at the time based on what was feasible at the time that those decisions were implemented and were made. Let's start with some refutation. Now, really, their biggest point was all about this false dichotomy. They told you we can't possibly balance, the economy and the environment. They almost tried to make it seem like it was mutually exclusive. But, Mr. Speaker, the role of the government in and of itself is to be able to balance those priorities. We should be able to balance both the environment and the economy. We don't really understand that point on their side of the House. Now, they also went ahead and made this grand assumption that, if the government does nothing, then people will step in. Because as of right now, the reason people are doing nothing, the reason people aren't working harder on climate change is because they're relying on their governments to do this. We fundamentally disagree with this. We think it's the role of the government to step in when people aren't doing anything, and we just wholeheartedly disagree with this assumption that they made. So let's start by talking about the role of the government, something that I think needs a little bit of clarifying. Now, we think that the role of the government is to step in when there's a change that needs to be made that only the government can achieve. And this is something that's key. This is something we're going to clarify. Now, before we even get into that, let's talk about, the nature of a free market, right? We all know a free market is one that's well regulated. But the question then becomes, how exactly do you regulate it? Well, in most cases, you leave it to consumers. You do what side government tells you. You leave it to the people. You leave it to them to decide. However, when we see a market failure, when we see people aren't acting a certain way, and it's the government's job to step in and to nudge certain behavior, that's when the role of the government comes into play. We think that climate change is a very specific example of this. We know it's important as the government. We think that if people can't see that and aren't acting in a way that reflects that, it's our job as the government to act, to show people it's important, to stress the idea that it's a priority. Do you disagree with this?
Also, Speaker, recognize that within our model, we told you that we don't think government action has gone far enough. We think that it could.
Exactly, and as I said before, we think that's actually very contradictory. You can't come up here with a resolution that says regrets government action towards climate change and then say we regret it because we actually think more climate change is better. It doesn't say a specific government action, it says government action as a whole. We'll continue to disagree with you on this. Back to my point. Why the government specifically? Well, we've told you that the government is a role model, right? Like, that's why we elect the government. We look up to them. We follow the laws that they put in place. They're people who are supposed to represent our needs, our wants, what is best for society. We also think that government action legitimizes the topic. If people aren't already talking about climate change, if they're not acting in a way that reflects that, then government action legitimizes it. It sends a message that this is important, this is something that Canada on a global scale cares about, and something that we prioritize. Now, more so, the government nudges behavior. Like I said before, when the market isn't acting appropriately. So, when we're not seeing climate change being prioritized in other sectors, in businesses, in market behavior, that's when it's the role of the government to step in, when the government has no choice but to do so. It's their job to nudge the behavior that they want to see reflected in all of society. Now, we do expect side opposition to come up here today and tell us, well, if you give people a chance, maybe they'll show you otherwise. Maybe they'll show you that climate change matters. Okay, fine. But let's look at the rate at which we're currently progressing and the rate at which climate change is becoming increasingly important. Sure, we can wait around like side government would have you, but, Mr. Speaker, these are critical times. We're seeing more and more that climate change is more important. It's being talked about. It's being discussed more. Why is this? Because we're in a situation where we're almost at the point of no return. If we continue to wait and stand idly by, like side government would have you suggest, soon there will be no climate action to be taken. That is why it is the role of the government to step in, to encourage that something is done now, rather than waiting for the future. We don't think that we have this luxury of time that they so claim you do. Finally, the idea that any action is better than no action. We think that government action provides a necessary starting point. It shows people what's important. It shows people what Canada values. From there, it's up to people to continue to act, to build off that. But we totally, regret the idea that they brought up that people simply don't do it right now because they think the government will. We don't think that they've actually proven that in any of their constructive arguments. We think we have proven our case that this is an example where it is the government's job to step in, to remind people of what's important. And we think that regretting failure altogether, like they talked about, essentially encourages inaction from both people on an individual level and at the government level. So because of the reasons I've shown you and the reasons you're soon going to be hearing from the rest of side opposition, we wholly oppose this motion and are very proud. Thank you.
Thank you, First Member of Opposition. I now call the First Member of Government to the podium for a 7-minute speech. The first and last minute will be collected.
Honorable Speaker, thank you for your time. So I'd like to begin this speech with just clearing up a few things about side government's case here. So on the topic of the resolution, side government regrets the action that the Canadian government has taken so far and the trajectory that it currently places us on and what it looks like we will take into the future. Now, side opposition raised in a POI that we cannot regret anything that might happen in the future. This is very true. What we say on our side of the House is that we have regretted all past Canadian government action because it has led us to a point of complacency where we have washed our hands, much like Pontius Pilate at the trial of Jesus, in this kind of unbelievable state, where we are able to simply say we have done enough. We are able to sit back, when in reality, side government here contends that we have not done enough. We are not able to sit complacent. We regret the past action because the government should have done more. We regret the past action because it has not gone far enough. We believe that we can run this motion, that this is a very fair stance to take on our side government. But, Honorable Speaker, I'll take my first POI.
Mr. Speaker, if you regret those actions, and specifically the resolution says regret government action in the past, do you not implicitly imply that you would have rather done nothing in the past?
Honorable Speaker, we are not saying anything of the sort. We are saying that it has created absolvency within the Canadian government. That's why we regret it. It never went far enough. We're not saying no action would be better. We're saying we regret the fact that more action has not occurred. That's still well within the realm of this motion. But, Honorable Speaker, I'll move on to the rest of my clash before I get into my contentions. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Today, the first speaker talked a lot about the false dichotomy that government action has created and the Indigenous alienation. I will be speaking about the economics of the motion and how this hasn't encouraged, this wishy-washy government stance has not encouraged innovation on sectors of the market that Canada could really use to diversify its economy away from natural resource polluting industry. And the third speaker will really be talking about bumper sticker activism and how this really has not gone far enough in the scope to actually move us forward to a place where we are able to effectively deal with climate change as a society. But, Honorable Speaker, just a few points of extraneous rebuttal, now that we have the regret cleared up. So they say the side opposition says that we say that the environment and the economy are mutually exclusive. We said nothing of the sort in our first speech. We say they aren't mutually exclusive. That's why the example of Denmark was initially brought up. Okay, and then the second piece of extraneous clash, not seeing climate change regulated. This is very true. Past Canadian government policy has not gone far enough to regret climate change. That's why we say they don't do enough, frankly. But, Honorable Speaker, I'm going to move on to my contentions. So what are the economic contentions I'm going to be bringing you today? Number one, that the current half stance of the government is so wishy-washy that what it does is it creates uncertainty in the Canadian market. So the example with this is the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Because governments treat climate change policy and economic benefit as mutually exclusive, companies are always left wondering which one in what case they will choose. So the Canadian federal government bought out the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Fine, but companies are still so worried that they might take other climate action against natural resource producing entities that Encana has moved now, Encana, an oil producing company, has now moved its headquarters down to Colorado. So really, there's so much uncertainty. Companies cannot decide what stance the government's going to take. They've not picked either. Whereas in the United States, at the very least, companies know what's going on. There's less risk in that market because the government's very, very clear about what stance it's taking. Is it the one that the Canadian government should take? No, we're arguing for more action against climate change, but at the very least, you limit market uncertainty that companies will face when trying to invest in your market. That's inherently helpful and a benefit on our side of the House. Okay, number two. There's no encouragement of innovation. So my third speaker will get a little bit further into this, but what has happened under status quo is the government's idea of action for climate change is to give mostly smallish grants to people to buy things like cars or household appliances. While that's great and a good first step, it hasn't gone far enough because frankly, how often do you buy a dishwasher? It's once every 15 years. That doesn't really it doesn't really play into any sort of market where there's consistent high demand. There are many more things that we buy quite a lot more. Like, why is there no regulation of the clothing industry, which literally contributes 15 tons of waste to landfills every year? Like, there's so much more that the government can do. And while the government's current policy is well intended, it's poorly executed. That's why we regret past government action. There's been a culture of complacency. The government can just wash its hands, say, call it a day, and go home. But that's not really the case because the people, the citizens, are suffering. That's why we regret past government action on climate change. It never went far enough. Okay, so what does this mean? This encourages very little innovation in the market because they've only given grants for things that are so low demand and that you don't buy very often. There's little innovation into things like clothing I brought up. There's also little innovation into the little things that you buy or use or throw out every day. This is a segment of the market that's being ignored, and then you simply push the problem onto the populace to say, hey, figure out a solution even though we haven't helped any companies and we haven't helped you figure out ways to like access any sort of renewable goods or like even encourage companies to develop any sort of renewable goods. But Honorable Speaker, I was going to go into how the government policy has created a tragedy of the commons, but I think I'm going to clarify the exact points I have brought to you today, specifically the economic impacts. I've told you how current government policy has created a culture of complacency within the legislative bodies, that they're totally okay with washing their hands because they think they've done enough, and this House regrets that specifically. We think that they could have done much, much more. And I've also told you the economic impacts this has had on society. I've told you that the half stance has created inherent risk in the Canadian market because companies do not know what's going on. They don't know what stance the government is going to take. I've also told you how that current government legislation has encouraged very, very little innovation into sectors of the economy. And Honorable Speaker, government legislation has been well intended but poorly executed, and I urge you to consider that in your decision. Thank you.
Thank you, first member of government. I now call the second member of opposition to the podium for a 7-minute speech with the first and last minute protected.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about what we've heard so far and clean up what has been so far quite a messy debate. I'll be doing a couple of things for you today. First, going through every contention we heard out of their side, and then extending the case of my side. My partner talked about how it was the government's role to act in this case, how they were justified in this case, and I will be talking about what precisely those impacts were and why we definitely ought not regret those impacts. So let's quickly go through everything we heard out of their side. First, I'd like to address this idea of a false dichotomy. So my partner did a very good job of telling the panel why the approach they've taken to this motion is simply not acceptable. However, I'm going to take them at their best just for argument's sake. Okay, we'd say that we still don't regret the past under their model because we contend with them in the first place that there even is a false dichotomy. What do I mean by this? Okay, we think that the false dichotomy they're talking about is really just what a government does on a day-to-day basis. It's a balancing of priorities. When a government, decides to do this for the environment, but also make sure that, companies which drill oil or companies which farm beef can still make somewhat of a living, I think that's a responsible thing that the government does. That doesn't mean they're living in a world of hypocrisy. It means that they're doing their job. So we contend with the fact that there's even a false dichotomy. So if you accept there's not a false dichotomy, we definitely can't regret what we've done in the past. All right. Furthermore, I think that they fundamentally mischaracterize reality when they talk about the future. Once again, this doesn't apply to the future, but let's just take them at their best. They mischaracterize the reality of things. No one is really being complacent, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone is on their highest alert in terms of the environment that anyone has ever been in the history of this world. Greta Thunberg literally just sailed across the sea and governments listened to her. That doesn't sound like people being complacent. The carbon tax is a actionable, tangible thing which we can see governments doing. There are meetings on this on a monthly basis. Ladies and gentlemen, no one is being complacent, so we certainly don't regret the past action. But no, thank you. So let's talk about what their second speaker brought to us. She talked about uncertainty in the market. We don't think that there were a lot of link work to really show us what the impact of this is. it basically rested on this idea that we get less innovation, stuff like that. We tell you that under our side of the house, based on what we've done so far, you actually do get a lot of innovation. We'd point to green technology as an example. Green technology only exists because the government has acted in this way, incentivizing governments or businesses to do this. All right, then they said, okay, we can do more, we can do more. That is why we regret things. That is always the case. Whenever a government does something, there's always a feasible option where they could have done more. But just because there's a better way to do something does not mean we regret what we did before. Our third speaker will be talking about this. So for instance, if 20 years ago the only way to cure cancer was an incredibly invasive surgery that put someone through a horrible experience, we don't regret that just because there was like a better way to do it. We just move forward knowing that there are better ways to accomplish our goals. Like just because there's a better way doesn't mean we regret things. All right. So let's actually talk about the extension on our side of the house. Like I said, my partner talked about the government's role, and I'll be talking about the government's impacts and why that is important. As a refresher, we talked about how there was definitely a market failure and the government was fully justified in stepping in this case, and we are proud of what the government has done so far and encourage even more future action. But why is the government such a great actor? So we have to ask ourselves what transpired by the action that this player, the government did, and why is that so desirable? Well, first we have to answer the question of why the government is a powerful actor in the first place. Well, we'd say that the government is taken far more seriously than an NGO, an activist, or even the market. Whether or not this should be the case, we can talk about that, but that's how it actually plays out in reality. Why is the government the single most powerful actor? There are a couple reasons. They have the power to make laws. They can tell businesses how to run themselves and make change. They can put caps on emissions. They can tell them to invest in green technology. They also have the power to affect global change with other countries through processes of international relations with the UN, I'll take you in a second, and they actually have the funds to impact this change. So when the government takes action in a way that has given us great impacts, we don't regret that, yes. Okay, look, there's certainly a lot more work to be done, but what we'd say is that having done nothing would have been far worse, and once again, that's what the resolution's saying. But even if we take you at your best and say, look, yeah, sure, we haven't done as much as we could have, the whole idea of there being a false dichotomy that your case rests on simply isn't true. It's a balancing of priorities, and I think that's becoming more of a concern moving forward. We're happy with that. Anyway, as I was saying, onto those impacts of the government. We also think that the government sets the narrative for basically all of Canada and the world moving forward about what to care about. So when the government acts on something, the society as a whole pays greater attention. Even if there is some of that hypocrisy within it, which we don't think that exists, it's just responsibility. So what is the impacts of the government actor? There's kind of two big ones. One, when the government acts, it actually give a voice to NGO lobbies and you get more activism. B, you actually incentivize business innovation. Those are two really great impacts the government has had so far. So let's talk about the environmental lobbies. So having a climate change plan means that you're willing to listen and take seriously the concerns of those groups. In fact, all NGOs and lobbies want is the government's attention to their priorities. Why? Because when the government gives it to them, the government will those priorities will actually get addressed. We think that government actions and even failures on climate change leads to more passion on part of activists, more attention to these issues, because their complaints may actually get addressed. That is something really good that we have on our side of the house. More activism is always good, and the government shines the brightest light for those individuals. But second, it incentivizes green business in two ways: greater concern for CSR, and you actually get green technology. We think that activists have minimal impact on how businesses are going to lead their operations. But when the government comes out, we actually get good outcomes. CSR came out in this age of the government starting to act. That's good because that ushered us into corporate responsibility. Second, and I'll finish up quickly, we get green technology. That would not exist without the government telling businesses, you need to change. And that's what leads us into the more sustainable future they seem to regret. That's really appalling. Thank you.
Thank you, second member of opposition. I now call the second member of government to the podium for a 7-minute speech, with the first and last minute respectively.
All right, hello ladies and gentlemen. So today I'll be speaking kind of about the bumper sticker activism and almost mismatched policy that we see our government undertaking on like existing policy regarding climate change, why we think ultimately this is incredibly damaging to like our current stance on climate change and climate change prevention overall. This being said though, I want to get into a little bit of clash, and I think I'll start this off by just like another clarification of what we think this round is all about. And I want to clarify what our stance is on side proposition. So we are saying that past and current government action has contributed to a culture of we've done enough within the government as far as climate change goes. And as my partners have pointed out, like the word regret doesn't wish that we mean nothing has been done. We think that it means the government has taken the wrong action. The government action is regrettable, and it's for that reason that like we now want to even, it doesn't mean that we don't wish the government had done anything. We think what was done was wrong. But this even being said, like let's take the other case at their best. Let's take side opposition at their best and say, look, even if we did take a no action, we still think that we might even be better off on our side of the house. And I want to tell you why. We think that the current government action that has been undertaken has absolved the government of taking further action and actually meaningful action to prevent climate change. I'll get into this a little bit in my speech, but for example, the Paris Climate Agreement is a great example of bumper sticker activism on behalf of the government that is like, look, great, we did this thing and we're gonna sign it. It wasn't even binding, ladies and gentlemen. And this is super problematic for governments to like call this policy and call it like meaningful climate change action, when in reality, it has had very little impact on Canada's internal structures and policy, and has almost absolved the government of taking further action and to the correct action, ladies and gentlemen. With this out of the way, and I'll expand on this a lot more during my constructive, I wanted to speak to a couple of the points that were brought up by side opposition. So first, we got this idea that people aren't complacent, and people are, like, we're on track and taking meaningful action, I guess, which is contradictory to what I'll be telling you today. And we got the example of like Greta, the example of carbon tax. We have a couple responses to this. So first, on the topic of carbon tax at the provincial level is being repealed in several provinces. We think this is super problematic, and again, I'll speak to this later on about the mismatch that is occurring between our federal government and our provincial government, and how this creates ambivalent citizens who don't know what action to take, and how this just creates incongruent structures within our society, and is inappropriate and incorrect action on behalf of the government. In addition to this, we also think that we got this idea out of their side that green technology only exists because of government action. We take major issue with this, and we'll bring to you a couple examples. So first and foremost, green technology exists because of people that are passionate about climate change as individuals and start it up. So for example, like Tesla, they did not get a whole bunch of like government grants to start this money. They started this up because they saw a niche industry that could be taken advantage of, and they wanted to innovate in this industry. It is another example, like even large corporations such as Synovus recently just mentioned that they're going to be investing another $1.5 billion into green technology. This is proof, and they're not getting a subsidy for this, ladies and gentlemen. So this is proof that green technology does not only and solely exist because of government subsidies. This is proof that individuals are able to take meaningful action, and the government should take meaningful action as well. We don't think they've been doing their part, and we think that they can do more. They've taken the wrong action thus far. And again, we get this idea about a false dichotomy not existing, and that it's simply a balancing of priorities. We don't think that this is, we dispute this on the grounds that we get different messages depending on like the politician and depending on the audience of the politician in different instances. So for example, like when Justin Trudeau visits Alberta, he might say something that's like pro oil and gas or something like this. When he visits BC, he might get something that is about natural resources and more environmental. If he visits Saskatchewan, he might say something more about like agriculture. And we think that this kind of false dichotomy can be created in the sense that we get inconsistent messaging on behalf of our federal government, and we think that this trickles down into like the ambivalence of our citizens and then the policy that is created. With this being said, I want to get into my constructive material, and again, starting on the idea of bumper sticker activism. So I brought to you the Paris Climate Agreement, which again was an unbinding agreement for Canada, and honestly just kind of made the Canadian government feel better about our current policies on climate change. A lot of the Canadian legislation that has gone on so far in the agreements that we've entered into, again, are non-binding and don't create lasting impact in our society, and this is what is needed. This is what side government means when we say that the government has taken incorrect, wrong action, and why we regret the action that has been taken. But first, Honourable Speaker, I'll take a POI.
Mr. Speaker, the Paris Climate Accord was signed by almost every single nation on the earth. What alternative does the government propose that's better than that?
Sure, in the alternative we propose is honestly, in this instance, we don't think that any of the nations are even remotely on track to meeting it, especially Canada. So we think that even its existence in like all the countries signing it and us all being excited that we've like taken meaningful climate action, no one has taken meaningful climate action as a result of the Paris Climate Agreement, and it's like problematic in the sense that it absolves us of future responsibility to take meaningful action. It's like us saying that we've done enough when in reality we haven't, and this is why it is incorrect action and regrettable action on behalf of the government. This is why we regret it. And this being said, I want to get into this idea of mismatched policies. So we have kind of mismatched policy on two fronts, we would say. The first front we see mismatched policy is between provincial and federal government. And so example I gave you was like the cutting of the carbon tax, for example, in some provinces, whereas federally we don't see this happening. We also have an example of the government kind of failing to institute short and midterm policy to meet the long-term policy that they've entered into. So again, like with the Paris Climate Accord, we see that the government did not institute, even provincially or in other ways as well, short and long-term policy or midterm policy that helped like Canadian citizens and Canadian companies, Canada as a whole, reach like the lofty goals that we've set for ourselves. By this we mean, like, for example, in British Columbia and as well in California, just as like another interesting tidbit, I guess, there was a popular tax credit for like purchasing electric cars. And this was something that was extremely popular while it existed, and a lot of citizens of these places decided to purchase a lot of electric cars. When this was cut, people don't buy nearly as many electric cars. And this is incongruent with like the large, lofty policy that the government says that we want to meet in the form of the Paris Climate Accord and things like this. It is super important that the government takes cohesive action and makes cohesive policy to encourage the meeting of these lofty goals. So it's for this reason, for us, just genuinely insinuating that the action has not been enough and has not been the correct action, we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
Second member of government. I now call the third member of the opposition to the podium for a 7-minute speech for the first and last minute perspective.
Mr. Speaker, today's debate has been like, if you're in the ocean and there's two ships passing by each other, they're trying to shoot, but they're not really connecting. There's been arguments brought up by both sides of the House, and nobody can actually agree on what we're talking about here. When does that happen in a debate? That happens when the government fails to interpret the resolution correctly. Before I get into my refutation of all the points and the approaches taken to this debate, taken by side government, what I'm going to do is bring it back to the resolution. For I don't even know how many times we've done this, but I'm going to have to do it again. When you read that sentence, what does that say to you? This House regrets government action. That doesn't say this House regrets certain government actions taken. That says they regret taking it in the first place. That implicitly implies that you would have rather had nothing done than have the government take that action in the first place. Side government can't have it both ways here. They have to work with the resolution that they were given. So that being said, none of their points apply. They tried standing up and telling you we should have done a stronger job in the past. Well, what we would tell you to that is you can't take that approach. That is not what you can debate in this resolution. And I'm sorry, I've talked about it way too much in this debate. I'm not going to take the POI right now. What side government could have done is they could have come up here and suggested that a different actor could have best handled this in the past. For example, they could have said the government could have invested into technology firms because they think maybe they could find an innovative approach to, making the climate better. But they can't say that they would have rather the government taken a stronger approach in the past. It comes back to that wording. Unfortunately, it's a difficult one to work with, but it's what you have to work with. Regretting government action means you would have rather done nothing than had the government act at all. With that underway, it's important to continue to consider it. You cannot suggest that past actions, that's one approach. You can also suggest that the past actions did worse for the environment. Yeah, that's an approach that you can take, but even empirically, we would stand up here and tell you that that's absolutely not true, because we are talking about this now. We probably wouldn't be talking about this as seriously if it hadn't been something that the government took as seriously. And you can even stretch it, even though this is still out of the spirit of the debate, to say that we would have rather done nothing, but now, starting from the future, we'll take a hardline approach. And to that, we would say, absolutely not. It's to the point of no return. But unfortunately, these are the approaches that you had to work with on side government. You couldn't come up here and tell us, we'd rather not have any government action, but in fact, we would have done a stronger. Do you see how contradictory that is? We're getting so muddled and confused because that's not a debatable resolution topic. With that underway, with the understanding that the points that they brought up really can't even be debated, let's start to jump into these points that they actually had. This false dichotomy. They talked about how it's an economy versus the environment approach, and that's what's taken place in the past, and that's because of the actions that the government took. And again, using the analysis I just used, your solution for this under the resolution is to have not done anything. We think that the actions taken are still better than not having done anything in the first place. Whether they had been optimal or not is another question. We on side opposition can stand up and say, yeah, we think they should have been stronger. That's not an approach that you can take as side government using the wording on the board. Second point, they brought up this idea of wishy-washy policy hasn't done enough. Really, this falls into the exact same train of thought. My side of the house actually gave you a lot to work with. We took you at your best in a lot of the cases where we really didn't have to. Really, you failed to prove your point under the resolution that we saw, and because of that, this debate has just gone out of track. Finally, we heard something from the third speaker on side government where they said past actions have absolved the government from taking further action. And that's something we can maybe work with here, because you can suggest, again, what I talked about. You can say it might have actually made it worse for the environment, the past actions. That's something we can talk about. But even to that, hindsight is 20/20. You're saying that from an approach in a position where you have been given that place of emphasis by the government, by the past actions. So without the actions taken, you wouldn't have this hindsight in the first place. And I'll take you.
Okay, recognize though, Honourable Speaker, that this motion is about regretting actions. So regretting is a past perspective. It is hindsight, actually.
Yes.
So hindsight is 20/20.
Okay. For the last time, I will not take another POI if it's about the wording of this resolution, because it's gone beyond this now. Regretting the past action of the government. Regrets government action means you suggest you did not want the government to do what they did. And implicitly within that stated that you would have rather them do nothing. That is what that resolution means. That's what the wording means. That's what this debate is about. Furthermore, moving beyond this, let's talk about Tesla like they like to bring up. They said, the government didn't do that. That was Tesla providing a market value approach. Tesla got subsidies from the government. Okay, let's not forget that. That was government intervention. Point for our side of the house. And finally, they talked about bumper sticker activism. They said that this is really what's resulted from the past actions of the government. This is what's been brought to the House today. And to that, we would say that's what it was before the government did anything. This is just a remnant from the past, okay? It's gone beyond that. That's just a remnant from the past. We talked about this before, but it's important to remember. Hindsight is 20/20. When we look back, any action always would have had a better way. That being said, that doesn't change that the cards you were dealt with in that moment is the optimal way that you thought you could have moved forward. We can stand up here all day and say we would have done it differently, but I would wager that you in that position at that time, when you thought that was the best thing to do, you acted accordingly. You can stand up here all day and say that you would have done it differently, but you wouldn't have. And furthermore, it's hypocritical today to suggest that you have the answers now, when 20 years from now, you could be looking back at it and saying, that was actually not the right approach. Mr. Speaker, if you can take away one thing from this debate, it's that government failed to outline this properly, and from that, we are proud to oppose.
Thank you, third member of opposition. I now call member of side opposition for their 4-minute rebuttal, which is completely effective.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to try to put this differently for everyone in the room, and I know we're all tired of hearing it. Listen to the difference. This House regrets government action to combat climate change versus this House regrets the way the government acted towards climate change. The second is what they debated. They debated that they regret the way the government acted towards climate change, not that they regret the government action towards climate change to begin with. That is the difference. The word regrets means we wish something did not happen. Not that it did happen, just we wish we did it differently. I'm going to put that to rest now. We're never talking about it again. With that in mind, let's refresh everyone of the case line that we put forward on our side of the House. We said, look, they have to prove why an action that did in fact have real positive impacts, that was in fact justified by the government, and that in fact provided great learning opportunities for us in hindsight, was regrettable. They did not answer that question on their side of the House. They didn't tell us why perhaps we weren't justified. They didn't tell us why those positive impacts perhaps weren't positive or weren't positive enough, because they certainly were positive and we can't regret doing those. And they certainly didn't tell us why we regret learning the lessons we learned from undertaking this incredible beast of handling climate change, address any single one of them, and perhaps there's light at the end of the tunnel. But the real reason why they've been unable to answer that question is because they gave us no criteria to decide when an action is regrettable in the first place, right? It is, so we have there's a couple options. Is an action regrettable when it wasn't the most effective? Is an action regrettable when people suffer? Is an action regrettable when the government contradicts itself? Because if any of those were the case, especially the whole when the government contradicts itself piece, then we have to regret almost every political campaign that ever was run. We have to regret every policy that was ever enacted, because life is full of contradictions, ladies and gentlemen. And we've told you on our side of the House that when those contradictions arise, it's not because these politicians are bad people who want to greenwash the government. What's really happening is a balancing of priorities. We cannot look at environmental issues in a vacuum. That is what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, look, the environment is the most important issue. We can't consider the economy, can't consider health, we can't consider our international stance, we can't consider any of that, because if we do, we're greenwashing our citizens and not actually paying attention to what really needs to be looked at. But before I finish off, I would really like to address one big question, because this is us taking them at their best. Their whole argument was that we have become complacent and therefore we must regret these specific actions that the government has taken. So if we convince you that we haven't actually been that complacent, then it actually falls to our side of the House. Okay, so we tell you, no, we have not been complacent whatsoever. We've pointed to many examples of this, but I think that everyone in the room can also attest to the fact that never before in history has the environment been such a concern. Never before has environmental lobbies have the voice they have today. Never before has green technology been as promising as it has today. This is the epitome of environmental attention, and we are very proud of what we have addressed as a nation. We are proud of that. We don't regret it. When we look in hindsight, like my partner said, are there aspects that we could have done differently? Sure. But at the end of the day, that is what those individuals in the political climate 20 years ago were working with. They were able to come up with something that did make actionable change, apparently not good enough for them, and we are excited to move forward. And for those reasons, we are proud to oppose. Thank you. To oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Son Opposition. I now call a member of side government for their 4-minute rebuttal.
Honorable Speaker, on our side of the House, we think that yes, knowing about climate change is important, and we agree with opposition on the fact that yes, nowadays people know way more about climate change and climate action than they did maybe 30, 40 years before. But we think that just simply knowing does not necessarily entail action. We don't necessarily think that the two are correlated, and they haven't been correlated in society as of today. Additionally, side opposition tells you a lot about the fact that we can't necessarily tell you that we didn't think the government did enough in the past, or we have to tell you somehow essentially that the government should have done nothing in the past. We don't necessarily think that that's fair. We recognize, of course, a lot of action and a lot of climate change action did result because of government policy. We think that's good. But what we told you is that it was the wrong policy and that didn't actually necessarily help us out as much as it could have. Recognize that past doesn't necessarily mean 20, 30 years ago. It also means actions that were taken in the past 5 or 6 years. We think that the government has, what it has done is that it didn't actually learn from its past mistakes because they continued to make those mistakes even 2 or 3 years ago. A lot of actions that were taken, we don't actually think that the government learned and was able to take better actions like opposition might tell you. We think they have continuously taken the wrong type of action that has only absolved them of responsibility, has only allowed them to take a soft stance and simply say that we've done enough and there isn't anything more that we can do. So yes, we recognize that there have been issues within this debate. What we tell you is that we still side with our case. We tell you that the government took the wrong action and it could have been done better. We don't necessarily have to advocate for any specific action. We told you all actions that the government has taken have not necessarily been beneficial. We don't think that this means that we have to tell you that no action should have been taken at all. We don't necessarily think that that's our burden. We think within this motion we are still able to regret the past actions that have been taken and the fact that they weren't done to the best of their abilities, and we don't necessarily think done. So we recognize we'll take side opposition at their best. We'll try and clarify this round and bring it up to where it should be and to the best case scenario. So recognize that, okay, on side opposition, in terms of the social realm, the social theme, the essential approach is that perhaps we essentially can't necessarily take this approach. We needed to provide you with some alternative. We told you in our speeches that we did provide you with alternatives. We told you that governments can take perhaps more targeted action that might be more beneficial in the future. So if they tell us that we can say that we regret all past actions and maybe we'll look towards the future, we think that we've adequately done that. We've told you we regretted the past action. There are ways to move forward in the future, and that's done through having more specific or more targeted policy. Even if we take the case that opposition has told us where we did nothing at all, perhaps this might have simply been better because this doesn't necessarily, it might have actually encouraged for there to be better outcomes and not the government just hiding behind this platform of environmental sustainability, but essentially absolving themselves of responsibility. Even if we took that approach, we still think this motion falls on our side of the house. We don't think that what the government has done has actually benefited anybody. We think that, like we've told you time and time again, Indigenous people have continuously been alienated by the government through climate change advocacy. We've told you that the economy has actually suffered and hasn't actually been able to grow because of past motions and past things that have been done. We told you again that there's this mismatch between short-term goals and actually getting people to that point. We think that this has all been done in the past, and it's still the approach the government takes as of today. And we told you it is bumper sticker activism. It's the government throwing on a label and saying that we are environmentally friendly, and we've been environmentally friendly since the past 10, 15 years. But recognize that this is not environmental sustainability. It may be well-intended, but it has been heavily, poorly executed. We are so proud to propose.